Artificial intelligence is changing basically everything, and that now includes the very medicines we all rely on. From discovering new drugs way faster to making sure they're manufactured perfectly, AI is really stepping into the lab and into the factory. But with all that power comes a whole lot of responsibility, right? So, how do we make sure these incredibly complex algorithms are safe, reliable, and actually trustworthy? That's the big question we're diving into today.
I mean, think about it. Could an AI help create your next medicine? And look, this isn't science fiction anymore. AI is already being used all across the drug development lifecycle. But that just leads to an even bigger question. How do we know we can trust what the AI is telling us, especially when our health is on the line?
Because the potential here is just incredible. On one hand, you've got the promise of speeding up drug discovery, creating treatments that are tailored specifically to you, and seriously improving the quality of manufacturing. But on the other hand, there are some very real dangers. What if the data used to train the AI is biased? How can we be 100% sure the model is accurate? And what about that black box problem? When even the people who made the AI can't fully explain how it came up with a certain answer. So, to help us navigate this tricky new world, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has stepped in. They've put out what's called a draft guidance, and it lays out a whole framework for how we can build trust in AI when it's used for our drugs. And that guidance document is exactly what we're going to break down in this explainer. So, how does the FDA even propose we handle this? Well, their whole approach is actually built on one really smart core idea. And it's called the context of use, or COU for short. Now, this is crucial. The FDA isn't trying to approve AI as some big general thing. No, no. They're focused on the specific job a model is supposed to do. Think about it like this. You wouldn't use a flamethrower to toast a marshmallow. Well, maybe you would, but you probably shouldn't. The tool has to be right for the task. The FDA wants to know exactly what that task is, what question the AI is trying to answer, and what its specific role is going to be. All right, so once you know what the AI is supposed to do, what's next? Well, the next step is to figure out what could possibly go wrong. This entire framework is risk-based, which means you have to understand the stakes before you do anything else. And that brings us to this term, model risk. Now, this isn't just about some technical glitch or, a line of bad code. Model risk is all about the real-world consequence of a bad call from the AI. It's the chance that a wrong answer from the model leads to a bad decision that could actually end up harming a patient. So, how do you measure that risk? Well, the FDA's framework breaks it down into two key factors. It's all about balancing how much the AI's decision matters against what happens if it gets it wrong. First, you've got model influence. How much sway does the AI's answer have? Is it the final word or just one opinion among many? And second, you've got decision consequence. What are the actual stakes here? And this matrix is where those two ideas really come together. You can see along the bottom axis, you've got model influence, and going up the side, you have decision consequence. The further you move up or to the right, the higher the risk gets, from that light gray, low-risk zone all the way to the dark, high-risk area. And the logic is super simple. The higher the risk, the more proof you're going to need to show that the AI is trustworthy. Okay, so you figured out the risk. What now? Well, that brings us to the FDA's 7-step plan for establishing what they call credibility. You can think of this as the actual roadmap for developers to follow. The first 3 steps, they're all about laying the groundwork, getting your ducks in a row. Step 1, you have to clearly define the question the AI is trying to answer. Step 2, you define that super important context of use. And then step 3, you use that matrix we just looked at to assess the model's risk. It all starts with being absolutely crystal clear about what the problem is and what's at stake. And this is where it gets really interesting, because we can see how this works in the real world. Let's look at 2 examples from the FDA's own document. For drug A, an AI in a clinical trial is deciding if a patient is low risk for a life-threatening reaction. Now, because the AI is the only thing making that call, its influence is high. And since a mistake could be fatal, the consequence is also high. Boom, that puts the model risk squarely at high. Okay, now look at drug B. Here, an AI is checking if vials are filled correctly. The consequence of a mistake is still high. That affects patient safety. But, and this is the key part, there's also an independent human check. That extra step lowers the AI's influence to low, which brings the overall model risk down to medium. See how that works? And that brings us right to step 4, actually creating the plan to prove the model's credibility.
This is the how, the specific steps you're going to take. And you can bet that the path is way, way steeper for that high-risk drug A model than it is for the medium-risk one for drug B. The rigor of your plan has to match the risk. It just makes sense, right?
And a huge, huge part of that plan is all about the data. The FDA couldn't be clearer on this. The data you use to build and test the model absolutely must be fit for use. That means it has to be relevant, so it represents the right patients or processes, and it has to be reliable, meaning it's accurate, it's complete, you know where it came from. The whole garbage in, garbage out thing is just not an option when people's health is at stake. The last 3 steps are all about execution and follow-through. Step 5 is pretty simple. You actually do the plan you just made. Step 6 is documenting everything, what worked, what didn't, any little changes you had to make along the way. And finally, step 7 is the ultimate judgment call. Based on all the evidence you've gathered, is this AI model good enough for its specific job? But here's the thing, the work doesn't just stop once a model gets a green light. An AI isn't some static tool you can just set up and walk away from. And the FDA gets that. The reason is something called data drift. See, an AI model is only as good as the data it was trained on. So what happens if the real-world data it starts to see over time looks different from its training data? Maybe a new group of patients comes along, or a tiny part of the manufacturing process changes. If that happens, the model's performance can slowly get worse and worse, and you might not even notice.
So, to fight this whole data drift problem, the FDA guidance requires a plan for what it calls life cycle maintenance. This just means developers have to keep an eye on the model's performance over its entire life, making sure it stays fit for its job. This is especially important in places like manufacturing, where things can and do change over time.
So, when you step back and look at the whole thing, what does this framework really represent? Well, I think it's a blueprint for building trust. Trust between the people making the AI, the regulators, and, most importantly, all of us as patients. So, if you remember anything from this, remember these key points. First, this whole FDA approach is risk-based. The higher the risk, the higher the burden of proof. Second, that context of use is king. It's always, always about the specific job the AI is doing. Third, high-quality data is completely non-negotiable. And finally, it's so important to remember this is still a draft guidance. The FDA is basically saying, hey, this is the start of a conversation, not the final word, and they're really encouraging developers to talk to them early and often.
So the FDA has laid out a really clear, really thoughtful plan for how we can begin to trust AI in medicine. It's a framework that tries to balance incredible innovation with critical safety. But it leaves us with one last big question. As artificial intelligence keeps evolving at a mind-boggling speed, will our methods for making sure it's trustworthy and our own ability to actually trust it be able to keep up?